I'm Josh Busby from the University of Texas at Austin. The title of our memo is Getting De-risking Just Right on Critical Minerals and Battery Supply Chains. Through concerted efforts and government support, China has come to dominate both the critical mineral space and wider supply chains for the clean energy transition, including batteries for electric vehicles and solar panels. With rising geopolitical tension between the two countries, U.S. policymakers have described these not only as risks to the U.S. economy and manufacturing, but also as threats to U.S. national security. Well, what they are precisely worried about is not always clear. There are four different dimensions of national security that policymakers have flagged at different points in time with respect to China's domination of supply chains for critical minerals and battery supply chains. Three of these logics have already been identified by the academic literature. The first has to do with dual-use technologies that have both civilian and military applications. The second involves risk of coercion by resource holders. The third speaks to cybersecurity risk to critical infrastructure and beyond. The fourth, a new issue, deals with the risk to the commanding heights of the economy being dominated by a peer competitor. Our memo unpacks each of these and assesses their relative validity with our judgment that areas associated with dual-use technologies and commanding heights are perhaps the most important areas of concern. A year or two ago, there were casual invocations of the decoupling of U.S. and China's economies from each other. However, the policy conversation has evolved as the Biden administration has realized that complete decoupling is neither feasible nor desirable. The conversation now has to do more with de-risking the relationship through diversification of supply chains to include more onshoring, domestic production, and ally shoring, sourcing from friendly countries of supplies. This suggests that there has to be a more nuanced conversation about where it is appropriate and where it is not appropriate for there to be Chinese involvement in these supply chains on national security grounds. While there may be overlapping economic and domestic political rationales for de-risking, national security rationales may be asserted even in the absence of compelling reasons, because this may reinforce demands for rejecting specific projects or associations. National security rhetoric has the power to silence other competing concerns. Years ago, former Secretary of Defense Robert Gates suggested that the approach to national security and exclusion from U.S. market participation for potential rivals ought to be one of a small yard, high fence, for which only a handful of critical areas are subject to export controls. Analysts have applied that concept to China, both for export controls, but also in thinking about which technology sectors might be subject to limits for Chinese imports and investments. In recent years, the yard of potentially excluded products has grown larger beyond areas such as weapon systems, mobile communications, and high-end semiconductors to batteries, port equipment, and electric vehicles. The risk is of an ever-expanding yard. While some restrictions may be justified, critics worry that overzealous use of restrictions on national security grounds may slow down the energy transition by adding to the costs. The headline for one piece criticizing restrictions on electric vehicles captured this sentiment. China hawks are putting the green transition at risk. Since runaway climate change itself is a national security threat, these concerns are worth taking into consideration. Moreover, interdependence between the United States and China may also function as a firebreak that limits either party's willingness to go to war, whether it be about Taiwan or something else. For interdependent economies, there are huge potential costs to both sides of a further rupture in their relations. The memo goes through the four different dimensions of national security risk. I wanted to say something about the commanding heights, as this hasn't really been flagged by the literature yet. In that section, we talk about what is old is new. The notion of the commanding heights of the economy of strategically important sectors that states want to sustain was once ridiculed as an artifact of a bygone era of heavy state intervention in Western economies and the failed policies of communism in the Soviet Union. However, China's success and ability to change its source of comparative advantage through patterns of state subsidy and investment and dominate whole industries has changed the conversation, particularly in an era when the market alone will not deliver the clean energy transition as quickly as is required to avoid dangerous climate change. Industrial policy and the intentional efforts by states to support certain industries and discourage others has become integral to efforts to hasten the clean energy transition. Alongside that change is the COVID-era realization that globalization wrought undesirable supply chain vulnerabilities that could only be addressed with more onshoring and ally shoring of production and exchange. The material basis of state power is partially military and partially economic. Economic power is fungible into military capability, and states have an interest in nurturing strategically important sectors that can generate wealth to finance their militaries. In the push to globalization of the last 40 years, markets were left to decide what economic sectors would be profitable. But the multinational companies that made those decisions were loyal to themselves and their profits rather than the welfare of their citizens or the tax bases of states. States are now seeking to reclaim a more explicit role in directing which industries to attract and support, to generate tax revenue to pay for services, to provide good employment, and to support other public purposes such as environmental sustainability. For the Biden administration, this foreign policy for the middle class is the embodiment of this revived role for the federal government, with Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the CHIPS Act among the legislative drivers to enact that vision. The notion, though, that some sectors are more strategically important than others requires justification, lest it become a get-out-of-jail-free card to justify protection of national industries at the expense of foreign competition. Such moves might ultimately be self-defeating if a country, even with aggressive subsidies and protection, cannot generate a viable industry. And industries that produce components and inputs that generate military capability have stronger claims of being strategically important. This includes aviation and shipbuilding, but is also a major reason why the US Congress and the Biden administration supported the CHIPS Act, with semiconductor chips having so many military applications. It is not clear that supply chains for batteries have quite the degree of sole supplier industry concentration as the chips industry. Chinese dominance of batteries and solar technology is relatively recent, driven by state action. Moreover, the scale of those industries is only a small fraction of what those industries will ultimately become. However, if more sectors of the economy, the power sector and transportation, to start, ultimately electrify, then batteries will become the cornerstones of the 21st century economy in the way that chips were in the 20th century. While there may be other industries that emerge as core economic sectors and sources of productivity, battery production and electric vehicles will certainly be among them. Now, this realization doesn't mean that Chinese participation in those sectors shouldn't happen, but the US has to carefully calibrate where it should happen. In the memo, we developed some principles for thinking through when Chinese participation is appropriate, such as when US firms can learn from Chinese manufacturing techniques of cutting-edge clean technology through licensing agreements. We provide more detail in the memo on these and other considerations and look forward to the workshop conversation.